The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowsky, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. So get ready to talk, email, or post a message to us. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, right to your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowsky.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you here again today. We are going to talk about elevating despair, suicide prevention and postvention. And we are very, very fortunate today because we have Barbara Rubel, who has a huge history in working with this very difficult topic. Now, Barbara has her own unique story. She was giving birth to triplets. And just 3 weeks before that, her father died by suicide. And, years later, she wrote about her own way of working with people who have struggled with the loss of a loved one, somebody you've known who was in so much despair that they chose suicide. And we get to spend an hour with Barbara understanding her version of how to make sense of all this. Because how does somebody make sense of all this when somebody makes such a decision and we're left grieving, confused, upset, maybe isolated from the people that we know, maybe ashamed and fearful that we can't speak about it? There's so much confusion after somebody takes that choice that in a lot of cases, we just choose silence. And silence is kind of the worst route to go because it's a kind of suffocating place after such a despairing event. So I want people to understand that every year on September the 10th, people and organizations in over 50 countries work to connect, to address the issue of suicide prevention and to support those individuals who are grieving after a suicide. And this year we'll talk about Barbara's book, but I didn't say goodbye, Helping Families After Suicide. But I want to just tell you that I've been going through this book, and it's really not just for families after a suicide. It's if you had a friend who, suicided, or you've been thinking about suicide, or somebody in your workplace, or maybe a family member, but not necessarily. And I also found as I was going through the book that it was particularly useful from the perspective of a clinician. So, if you're out there and you're helping people or you're in any kind of helping capacity, you may find that just reading through the book and the kinds of questions that Barbara puts in after each chapter really help you to have honest and meaningful conversations with people who have experienced suicide. I just find that it is actually really difficult. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just actually a very hard conversation to have when somebody has lost somebody to suicide, or somebody you're working with has lost somebody to suicide, and really leaning into that and actually being able to share that space, to hold that space, and to ask questions that are meaningful to the person who's grieving. So um, that all said, I want to welcome Barbara and thank her so much for spending the time with us today. If people are interested in asking questions about this topic, please do email us at instudio101@gmail.com. And just remember, we are working on ourselves as we do this reflection. It's an opportunity to bear witness to evolving mind, mood, health. And let me just start by saying thank you, Barbara, and welcome to the show.
It is such a pleasure to be with you today, to spend an hour on a topic that I'm very passionate about. But what you just said really resonated in me. You said choosing silence is a suffocating place.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need maybe in the next hour to take that breath and breathe into our loss and give it life, and maybe in giving it life, giving it meaning. Because if we can make meaning, as Bob Niemeyer notes, if we could find meaning in what happened, perhaps we can live with it and adapt and keep a connection to our loved one and be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean those are big words, because I know you're not speaking from an academic position or perspective alone. I know that you've experienced your own grief and loss when your father died, and there are these theories like Rando's 1993 six process theories, and those four phases, of avoidance, confronting, accommodating. Like there are quick kind of ways to look at these things, but the reality is that it's just so tough. There's one thing about the tasks that we have to deal with, like, and again, this is, from your book, reflecting on different models, the four tasks of mourning, that CBT approach: accepting the loss, processing the pain, adjusting, and then embracing your new life. And can I just start by asking you, how did you do that from a personal perspective? I would really, really like to know, and I'm sure our listeners would like to understand, how do you face something so big and go through steps like that?
Well, it was so difficult for me to go through those tasks, because how could I accept the reality that my father shot himself when I was in the hospital giving birth to triplets? How can I accept that if I was not allowed to attend the funeral or the wake or be a part of any of the rituals that a daughter needs after her daddy dies? So to accept that he really is dead, I needed to maybe see pictures of the grave. I needed to, my mom gave me one of his favorite, like a radio that he had, and some of his favorite objects that I knew that I never would have got those things if daddy was alive. So I needed to accept that he really was dead, because I wasn't at a funeral. Just like what's going on with COVID-19. How do these people know their loved ones are really dead? They're told on the phone, but they can't attend a funeral. They can't be a part of these mourning rituals. So suicide and COVID right now, accepting that reality is very, very hard. And processing that pain, for me personally, I processed it through my babies, just, holding them and loving them, and not going to a negative part like taking drugs or alcohol. But suicide, like COVID-19, processing the pain, people are alone. They can't process pain with other people. So I think drug use is going to go up. I think alcohol use is going to go up. I think suicide is going to go up, because processing that pain alone without a system in place it's going to make that task very hard. And then adjusting to the world without the deceased. For me personally, my babies that brought them home from the hospital, everyone's taking pictures. How beautiful, 3 little boys. It's such a blessing. My dad's not in any of the photos. He's not passing them around with cigars. Adjusting to the world where my mom would walk in the room without him. That is so painful. And that's why as time moves on, we find this connection, this spiritual connection while we move along on this path called life. As I did, my babies grew up. I had another son 3 years later, Brian, and I remember my dad. You remember your loved one, and you just incorporate that into the rest of your life. Basically, what I did was I continued the bond with my dad. Yes, I know he's physically dead. I accepted that fact. I've processed the pain. I adjusted the world, but he is still so much a part of my life because I maintain that bond with him spiritually.
And wasn't that difficult for you to do, to let yourself continue with that bond? Weren't you angry? Did you feel any guilt? Were you, horrified by, like, how did you really face that?
Not in an easy way, because suicide, the person did it to themselves. So I was maybe a bit angry at Dad for doing it when he did it. My question, a question that was posed to me quite often was, why did your dad kill himself right before you're about to give birth? And my answer would be, well, would it have been better if he did it a week after? So that was confusing to me. But in my grief, I think maybe guilt was big, because I felt like, well, maybe I could have done something. Maybe in the last time I saw him, I should have seen a sign. I think that the guilt was huge. I think I blamed my mother, because my father had deteriorating discs in his back, and his suicide note said, I cannot live with the pain any longer, and so I'm choosing to end my life. And so my mom lived with him. So there was a bit of blaming her, like, didn't she see it? Or blaming the doctor. Couldn't he have done something? The anger wasn't as strong as the overall sadness that he wasn't there to hold the babies. These were triplets. It was so exciting. And he would have been such a loving, beautiful, warm-hearted grandpa that broke my heart.
I think it breaks my heart just hearing you say that, like just how emotionally upsetting something like that is, and what it takes to really leave space inside of yourself, Barbara, to come to terms with something like this.
I don't think we come to terms in a bubble. I think we have to move within and look at our own personal strengths and like grab into them. Like, my greatest strength is love of learning. And so I needed to learn everything I could about suicide. I became an administrator with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I joined the American Association of Suicidology. I got involved with a quilt and making a quilt with Span and Save and all these organizations. And I learned from them, and I got on committees. And by giving back to my communities, by starting my own support group in 1990, I think it was 1991 or 1992, I created Solace, Sharing Our Loss After Suicide. And so I facilitated a suicide loss support group for several years. And I think that I managed to cope with the pain of my dad's death by giving back to my community. That's how I did it.
Wow. It's like you found, in a way, it's like you found your tribe too.
I did, but I think that's how we find meaning. I find meaning by honoring my dad's memory. I speak about suicide awareness no matter what I'm talking about. Like right now, I do a lot of radio and podcasts on COVID-19, but I get suicide in there through the conversation because it's so important. I feel very strongly about suicide awareness. And in doing that, it honors his memory. I'm also all about advocacy and identification with other survivors. You know, by doing what I do, I think it's really important for me to destigmatize my dad. I like to talk about his life rather than his death, and how great he was, and how he was in the Army as a sergeant in World War II, or that he was a New York City police officer, along with my mom. She too was a New York City cop. And how I continue the bond, or the ongoing impact he has on my life, speaking about suicide awareness. And hopefully, even in this hour, perhaps, Anna, you and I are preventing a suicide, or there's someone listening who has just experienced a suicide and now knows that they are not alone. So we find meaning in so many ways.
Yeah, true. You know, it's interesting what you were saying before, that you were reaching out to community, you were building networks. And, you know, from the research, that actually seems to be the one of the, it's not the only, but it is one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, that we not become terribly isolated, that, you know, especially with our pain, you know, that we start to learn that, in fact, we can share our pain with other people, and that people are not, I mean, people are not going to reject us. Some people may reject us. Some people cannot hold that space. But there are people who are ready and willing and able to lean towards you, Barbara, and all of the listeners out there. There are people who are willing and able to lean towards you and to share the despair that you're experiencing, to hold that space, to witness what you're going through. Now, it's true, you know, we might not be able to give you a job, or, you know, fix, you know, some kind of relationship issue that you're having, but you don't have to do this alone. And I think that's one of the very important things that, you know, I want to say to people. It's like, find ways to connect that feel meaningful. And what are your thoughts about that, Barbara? Just how important community, or formal or informal supports are.
I recently did 2 programs on community coping with loss, specific to suicide. One was on Open to Hope, and the other was on Friends for Survival. And there are organizations like Open to Hope or Friends for Survival where you just have to go online, type in, "I'm a suicide loss survivor, help me," or something like that. And all of these wonderful resources come up because we are so disenfranchised in our grief. Like Ken Doka, he says that disenfranchised grief is when our loss can't be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported. So, you know, women who experience infertility or pregnancy loss, if your beautiful dog just died, or in my case, my dad dying by suicide, or like so many people right now, disenfranchised grief in a pandemic, especially if a person refuses to wear a mask and they become infected and spread the illness in their own family and that person dies, blame, guilt. We are experiencing disenfranchised grief right now because we are not allowed to socially mingle and share our loss with others. We're not getting hugged. We're not getting the love we need, and while we're saying goodbye to someone we cared about. And so that's disenfranchised grief, and it's really hard. So we must reach out through the internet, telemedicine, telehealth, or just typing in words related to grief and see what pops up to help you manage that loss.
Yeah, it's so important. I want to read something from your book by Edwin Schneidman. It's a really beautiful quote. It's typically postvention extends over months during that critical first year, and it shares many of the characteristics of psychotherapy: talk, abreaction, interpretation, reassurance, direction, and even gentle confrontation. It provides an arena for expression of guarded emotions, especially such negative effective states as anger, shame, and guilt. And I really liked this quote because, I mean, I think one of the difficult things that people experience when they face any kind of horrible event is they're kind of expected to just kind of like, okay, yeah, this thing happened, now move on. And that's not the way grief works. And, especially complicated bereavement in cases of suicide. I mean, there is a multiply, series set of events that could occur that can reignite that level of shame and guilt and terror and confusion, from anniversary dates to special events to just seeing somebody who looks like that person or reminds you of that person. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, those are triggers, and they it's interesting because it just brought me back to a flashback of my support group so many years ago, and someone was talking about just going down to the basement where their loved one died by suicide, and every single time he went back into the basement, he was reminded of his loved one's death every single time he got on the first step. Well, if you live in a home where you need to go in your basement every day, how do you deal with that trigger? There are triggers everywhere in life. For some people, it might be just eating a certain food and you're reminded that that was your loved one's food, and you just fall to the floor crying, and then after about a minute you get up and finish your meal. So we have to acknowledge that when we experience grief, especially a sudden traumatic loss, especially if it's complicated like so many of our losses are, that triggers will get in the way of our grief, but that we have the strength to manage those triggers. We have to rely on our strengths, our faith, our community, radio programs, podcasts like what they're listening to right now, books, organizations, friends, family, whatever it is. We need to know that we are not alone. And that, like what Schneidman, how you mentioned, the father of suicidology, that it's okay to express anger and shame and guilt. It's okay to talk about the depth of our pain and that we are not alone, but we cannot allow that anger to become rage where we act out upon ourselves or others, where we are so filled with shame that we refuse to talk about it. My mom, it was several years after the suicide, and I did a lot of early morning Christian broadcast radio, and she heard me talking about suicide on one of these programs, and she said, now everyone in my 55 and older community is going to know that daddy killed himself. I can't believe you were on the radio. And I'm like, first of all, Mom, nobody's listening to this radio program. It was 5 a.m. You just happened to be listening. But in that moment, I actually felt shame because she felt shame and or guilt, oh, maybe I shouldn't have shared this story. It's my mom's story too. So there are so many levels of this. I think we just have to be kind to ourselves, be mindful that we're only human. We're doing the best we can. And the most important advice is take a breath, just pause, just stop. We are so moving and going and moving forward. And sometimes it's okay to just be still and recognize, damn, this is hard. This is really hard, but we're not alone.
Yeah. Let's take a moment and read a few of these emails that we're getting from our listeners. But before we do that, I want to actually say something about your comment about your mother not being able to tolerate you speaking, and both what pain she must have been in that she needed to silence you, but also how hard it must have been on you, the kind of courage you must have had to have at that moment to use your voice because you knew this was going to be healing for you, meaningful for you, and in the face of your mother's her own pain, her own guilt, her own confusion and shame, she extended that towards you, and tried to get you to kind of go along with her need for silence. Was she ever able to address her silence?
No. It was my mom was 65 at the time of my dad's death, and she died at the age of 91. And we had very few conversations about the loss. All she wanted to talk about was his life. I think she came from a time when you don't talk about suicide. And we never talked about her belief system. But she always said, I believe that Daddy is still in Coney Island, walking the sand, enjoying his life. And that keeps me going.
Oh,
So
wow.
she lived in kind of, even though it was a sweet denial, she knew he was dead. But she needed to stay there. And I think my being on the radio or writing books, I'm very active. I'm online a lot. I'm on podcasts and webinars. To an extent, I was the trigger for her. So it made it difficult for her. And I wanted to keep her healthy and mindful, that it's okay.
So before we go to our listeners, I want to ask you this one question, because I imagine that there are other people who are dealing with this, who are needing to have an outlet, but noticing that the people around them would like them to be silent. What is your advice?
Oh, suicide loss support groups. Whether they are online, the best way to get through this is to be with other suicide loss survivors. And the resources are in the back of my book. I also just did a program with Sally Spencer Thomas, and I listed so many resources on her podcast. So I could do the same for YouTube. Maybe we can do that along with the radio program. Basically, there are organizations out there online like Open to Hope and Friends for Survival and SAVE and SPAN and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, etc., where they are not alone. You are not alone.
Yeah, and also I just want to mention that the World Health Organization, has a really good suicide prevention toolkit for engaging communities, and postvention too. That they've put together a really great guide that has a huge number of links and resources, and I would really encourage people to go and take a look at that too, especially if they're in a position where they have some kind of organizational role that would require them to do something, to have some engagement or involvement on an organizational level. Okay, now I'm going to take a look at some of these emails, and as you can imagine, my computer has stopped working. Okay, I got it. This is from Nan. Thank you so much, Nan, for your email today and tuning in. Nan says, first and foremost to Barbara, I'm so sorry for your loss. This topic is probably one of the most, if not the most, important issue of our time, especially with the world's COVID outbreak that has taken place. The good news is that there is always help out there for people contemplating suicide, but finding it can be difficult. Thank you for bringing this very serious matter to the world, Nan. Now, I just want to pick up what Nan was just referencing, that it can be difficult to find resources. And you've just a minute ago, Barbara, made mention of a whole lot of resources, which maybe if we could put a list together, we'll have that posted when the YouTube podcast comes out, and when the podcast is actually launched as well. Add those resources. But given that so much is going online, in fact, this precise moment in time, resources are actually a little bit more accessible because people can access them even remotely from wherever you are. Do you have any comments, Barbara, on really good resources people can get involved in, group-based support?
I wrote a training manual for facilitators on how to start a suicide loss support group and be the facilitator. It was going to be a book several years ago, and now I just give it out during my workshops and trainings. So I could list that as a resource, and people could just download it.
Well,
so
I'm just wondering, Barbara, if you think it would be beneficial if we could post that to our charity, traumapractice.org, as an online resource, because people would really find that very beneficial. We're doing a lot of online groups these days through the traumapractice.org. But it sounds like that is a phenomenal resource that would probably make a difference. And if it's something that you think would be beneficial and you want to partner with us on that,
That would
we
be
can put the bottom
great.
line.
Yeah, it's a valuable resource because it begins with, are you even ready to facilitate a suicide loss support
Yeah.
group? What do you need in your community? Who are the gatekeepers to actually being the facilitator? So I will definitely get that to you. Absolutely. It's great.
Oh,
But
that's
also,
great.
I think just people have to understand that there are gold practices out there like QPR to prevent suicide. There are things in place. And when you start clicking on AFSP or AAS, and you're like, wow, I want to get involved with this. You don't know what you're going to be most passionate about until you're in it and start clicking.
Mm-hmm.
I worked as a hospice bereavement coordinator for many years, but I always thought that I wanted to work with children who are grieving. But once my patients who were terminally ill, and once I started going into the nursing home, I realized that my passion was older folks. If I wasn't in it, I wouldn't have known that. So I think we just have to start clicking, and then we'll just get involved, and that will give us the impetus to find meaning and, just meaning to our experience, our loss experience. Got to get into it first.
Mm-hmm. It takes a certain kind of willingness and openness, and sometimes, after somebody's experienced a suicide, there's a need for something to be almost like an easier flow into. Like, some people are self-motivated and they'll put it together and make it happen, but I would say probably for the majority, they're going to want to be able to find something that is existing that they can just join in, and hopefully it's a good starting point. And I'm wondering, just as a starting point, you mentioned QPR.
Yeah,
Yes.
Question, persuade, refer. That's Paul Quinette's work.
Yeah.
I will make sure I get you all of these links.
Great.
For the listeners.
Yeah, because some of these acronyms, they're not known to our listeners, or even maybe to me, because I'm not an expert in suicide prevention or postvention. I mean, I know a little bit about it because of the work I do, and certainly have worked with individuals who have attempted suicide, who have had suicidal ideation, who who have had family members or friends who committed suicide. And it's like, what I keep hearing from people like that is just the extreme despair and the confusion, feeling alone, not wanting to share the story, the shame, and silence. Like, silence is so common.
It is, but now we're realizing that there's a name for it. It's prolonged grief disorder, and it's even going to go into the DSM. It is basically, what happens is, after a year has passed, you're still not okay. You experience this intense yearning for your loved one. You long for your loved one to come back, and you are so preoccupied with thoughts of them that it's like every day for at least the last month, all you're doing is thinking about them, that it's getting in the way of your day-to-day life. So this new complicated grief, whatever term they're going to call it, I think it's prolonged grief disorder, but it's always been called complicated grief. I think what we could focus in on is that if after a year you really think you need help, then it's because you feel like maybe a part of yourself has died. You have an absolute disbelief that your loved one really, truly is dead. Maybe you're avoiding reminders of them. You're angry, you're bitter. The sorrow is you're just so pissed that your loved one died. And so you can't move on with your life. You're not hanging out with your friends. You're not going to the gym, or, that was before COVID-19. You're not even planning for the future. Basically, you are so numb, like emotionally numb, that life around you it's meaningless. It means absolutely nothing. How can the world be moving? How could the world be turning? Doesn't anybody understand how lonely I am, how detached I am, how difficult this is for me that I can hardly breathe, let alone get dressed and go to work. So we need to recognize that sometimes grief is not a normal process, that sometimes it can get complicated, and you do need to reach out to someone to just work it through so you could take that breath and be okay.
Yeah, it's so hard to move forward sometimes when the shock is so big. Let's read a little bit more from our listeners. This one is from Pedro, and he says, "What an incredibly sad story. Wow, how could anyone cope? I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you for sharing this incredibly sad story." But you see, this is an interesting thing. So this comes from Pedro, but what you're sharing with us, Barbara, that is so rich is the fact that you found a way to find life after something so hard. In fact, you found a way to not get stuck. And I don't think that means that it was easy, but you were choosing life. You were choosing life. And what brings, what that takes me to is this whole idea of Tedeschi and Calhoun's post-traumatic growth model, in which they look at, finding strength, engaging in relationships, figuring out what are the new opportunities or possibilities that they are drawn to now. And part of that is allow yourself to be open to these things, because sometimes what ends up happening is you'll have these microseconds where you're like, oh my God, I would like to go out for a walk. And then you kind of squash that because the feelings of shame and sadness, depression, you don't want to be seen, you don't want to talk to anybody, you don't want anybody to see you or ask you a question. So you're kind of constantly squashing your own inner microseconds of motivation that surface. And it's like, I really want to encourage people to notice those microseconds of longing for life, because that will always come to the surface. And it's like, allow those to be your guide, because they will always be there. You just have to let yourself taste a little bit of that. Then there's gratitude for life and intensifying spiritual life. And I want you to maybe tell us a little bit about your thoughts about the post-traumatic growth model, but even more so, this piece around the spiritual life.
Yes, I think they go hand in hand, because most of us, I think Nan, you and Padro, we're going to wind up growing from this experience. We're going to wind up accepting the fact that our loved one died. We will cope. We will adaptively cope. We will build our resilience. We can experience what you just mentioned, that post-traumatic growth, where it's basically it's a positive psychological change experienced as a result of a struggle with a highly challenging life circumstance. When my dad killed himself, that was my struggle. So think for a moment about your personal struggle and the positive change that can compromise maybe appreciation for life now, that you could keep that memory of your loved one and share their story. Maybe you have compassion for other people, especially me in a support group. I have such compassion for other suicide loss survivors, thoughts that focus on new possibilities, all of which can come about when we carry out actions, maybe connecting with other people, creating rituals, even asking for help. This is all part of that Tedeschi and Calhoun post-traumatic growth model, that we can grow from this experience. And usually when you are traumatized and not that resilient and experience that level of trauma, you experience that post-traumatic growth. But for those who are really resilient, they can experience personal growth. So either way, personal growth, post-traumatic growth, we have a spiritual core, and we dig into that spirit to help us be mindful and cope with the fact that there is life and there is death.
Nicely said. Here's another one. This one is from Scott, and this one is a question, and it's one that people should really be aware of as well. Scott says it's such a sad topic. Are there ever any signs from people about suicide? I know that symptoms can be masked to some extent, but are there outwardly signs? So maybe Barbara, if you could talk about signs.
Yeah, well, there are risk factors, there are warning signs, people giving things away, or they're not eating, or they're pushing you away. But what's so interesting about suicide, and what I've heard from so many survivors, I'm saying hundreds of survivors through the 30 years I've been doing this, is how confusing it is, because they'll say, I didn't see a sign. As a matter of fact, my daughter joined a gym 2 days before she killed herself. Or my son was just graduating from high school, best grades in the class, and he killed himself. Or my mother died by suicide. She killed herself, and she was just getting the job that she always wanted. Sometimes it doesn't make any sense. If we understood warning signs and risk factors, and it was a perfect science, then we would no longer have suicide. We just have to be mindful that people suffer with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, where there's a high incident rate of suicide, that there's a link between depression and suicide. But the fact is, when you are living with a suicide yourself, you might be at a higher risk for suicide. There are so many factors. I think what we need to do is to be mindful of our friends and family around us. We know how they've always acted. And if we see something off, if we see them really sad or not eating or quitting their job or giving things away, then we need to get them help. We need to get them support. We need to get them to a therapist who has been trained in suicide prevention. Too many therapists are not aware of CAMS, or they're not aware of David Job's work, or how to provide support. They read a checklist and they think that's going to save the person's life. So I think we really need to educate therapists about suicide, so when we bring our loved one in for help, they know what to do.
Mm-hmm. Wow. You just said something that I think was probably one of the best things I've ever heard on this whole issue of warning signs, which is, hey, there may not be warning signs. It might not be straightforward. You may hear somebody is actually doing better. Like, they may have been depressed, and all of a sudden, they start doing things that are like very hopeful, or at least they look hopeful to you. And you're kind of going like, well, things look like they're turning around for this person, or my friend, or my spouse, or my child. They seem to be more upbeat. Maybe it's better right now. And then for something like this to happen, and I think this is another reason why sometimes we have to step back and say, wait a minute, the terrible burden that a lot of people feel when somebody commit suicide, and whether you're a professional, or you're a peer, or you're a family member or friend, sometimes these things happen and we don't see it. And I think that's really important for people to recognize that it's not just a checklist.
That's true. That is very, very true. But that's why it's so confusing, because society says, here's the checklist.
Mm-hmm.
Check this off and then you'll know. But it goes so much deeper than that. There's so much we do not know.
Mm-hmm.
That's why clinicians need to be educated about suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. And we, just as bereaved, need to educate ourselves. And I even think if you're not bereaved by suicide and you're just listening to this conversation, in recognizing that, this is Suicide Awareness Month in September in the United States, that perhaps now we should just learn the signs and be prepared and be ready. So if our loved one has some risk that we just triggers our brain, we'll maybe save a life. And that, what a God-given gift that is.
Yeah. Here's another one from Steve. Hello, thank you for this topic today. Excellent. It is a very sad topic, to say the least. Can your guest recommend any online resources or sources for this topic, and we're going to provide that. But Barbara, again, just for our listeners, could you just, if there's any websites that people may want to go to?
Well, I would start with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Okay,
And
great.
then I also think it really depends on who you are, because there are so many. There's Befrienders Worldwide, there's the Alliance of Hope for Suicide Loss Survivors, there's the Carson J. Spencer Foundation. There are so many organizations. So once you type in suicide support, they will all pop up. But I also think they should look into Centering Corporation or Compassion Books, because there are resources, there are books that you can buy online through Compassion and Centering that focus on not only suicide loss, but all types of loss. And before we got on this call, I received a call from a woman whose dog just died. And she was talking about her grief, which is so disenfranchised, because she said she feels guilty. Her dog of 15 years just died, and she's afraid to bring it up because so many people are dying of COVID. So we have to recognize, no matter at this time, whatever you are grieving, whether it is your pet, whether it is a loved one, a friend, or even your own freedoms right now, because we can't do all the things we have to do, that we are not alone. That all you have to do is go into the toolbar and type some things out, and that there are podcasts like this that you can learn about ways to help yourself through it, that you might be sitting in a room listening all by yourself with a cup of coffee, but you are not alone. There is always help, whether through books, resources, online support, and sooner or later we'll be able to get back to our friends and family. Maybe church, synagogue, mosque, your faith community are important too. We will get through this. We are still a community. Even though we're alone, we are still a community, and that is really strong.
Yeah. Now, I just want to mention again to people, I really want to encourage you, if you can pick up a copy of But I Didn't Say Goodbye, Helping Families After Suicide by Barbara Rubel, because not only is it an excellent resource and gives you a really good insight into this issue in general, but she has great references in the book as well as really great and thoughtful questions that I think will help people make sense of what's happened to you or what's happened to somebody that you care about or maybe somebody that you work with, and that that can be very important as well. Now this one is from Ty, and Ty says, hello to everyone. Thank you for this discussion today. This has got to be the most devastating topic of any human nature issue in the world today. Thanks for the discussion, as it gives people hope. And I think that it's true too. It does give people hope. Just being able to talk about it with you, Barbara, is helpful for me as a professional, because it reminds me of how to look at this issue with a little bit more clarity at times. Because I think even as a professional, having worked with clients who have loved ones that have committed suicide, I mean, I sit with a lot of compassion for their pain and grief and suffering. But it's easy also as a professional to feel that the pain is so big, and to figure out how to leave space for it is important, not just from a personal perspective if you have somebody in your life, but also from a professional perspective as well. This one is from Angela Wig, and she says, hi, just turned in. Does your guest have a website? Thank you. Barbara, do you have a website?
Yes, Angela, my website is griefworkcenter.com, griefworkcenter.com. And I'm a keynote speaker. I am basically all I do is webinars, but I offer trainings around the United States and Canada. So I'm hoping that sooner or later, Angela, Ty, Steve, Padro, Nan, even you, Anna, that we will meet at one of my conferences and just give each other a big hug.
So tell me the name of the website again.
Sure, it's griefworkcenter.com.
Great. Griefworkcenter.com. That's fantastic. So we will make sure that that goes on as well so that people can find you, Grief Work Center. And I think that's amazing because, you know, people want to figure out how they can get in touch with you and they should be able to do that. It's very, very helpful. Now, we've got a couple more, and I want to make sure we get to the rest of them. Carmen is saying, wonderful show, but very sad. Thanks for bringing all of this to us. I could not imagine how to cope. Bless the two of you for discussing all of this. Well, I just want to thank Barbara again because she's obviously bringing light to a topic that we do need to talk about and we do need to think about and better understand. This one is from Denise, and she says, the topic really touched my heart today. It is so very sad to hear about Barbara's story, but I'm very interested in the discussion that you're having because it brings to light what some people go through in their daily lives. Any thoughts about that, Barbara?
Yeah, well, Denise, thank you for sharing that it touched your heart. And what that shows me is that you are empathetic and you are compassionate. And I think if people can have an open heart to listen and learn, because this is such a hard topic, people would usually say, oh my gosh, suicide, I'm closing it, go turn to something else. Yeah. But Denise, you opened your heart to that. And so I appreciate your listening. And with Carmen, thank you for saying bless her. Because I believe for me, spirituality and faith is very important. That's how I get through this. It doesn't matter what you believe, whatever you believe in, whatever your higher power is, you hold on to that. You hold on to that today. You hold on to that when we are finished with this program, because perhaps that faith will be the only thing that gets you through the next tragedy in your life. And perhaps you'll reflect on this hour that we spent together and say, I'm not alone. I remember listening to Anna's program and she said we could be resilient. She said we could find meaning. I'm going to be able to cope with any complicated issues. I'm going to be okay. So thank you, Denise and Carmen, for adding that to today's program.
I know you'll remember this, Barbara, but before we started the program, I said, I never know how many emails we're going to get during a show because sometimes the topics are very engaging and sometimes they're really hard. And, and it's hard to know what to say, but obviously we have some pretty remarkable listeners and they are sending in a lot of their thoughts and their questions. And I just want to thank everybody who's listening to being engaged, because I think when we have these kinds of conversations and people use their voices, it actually helps to lighten the burden that we are all carrying when we face these difficult things. So again, just one more time, I will say, if people want to send an email to instudio101@gmail.com, we will read as many as we can before the end of the show. But I want to talk about kind of grief reactions when you're dealing with maybe children who are not getting an outlet to talk about what they've encountered. Like in your book, your character Alex is kind of carrying the burden of maybe not having a perfectly easy outlet after his own father commit suicide. And I wonder if you could talk about just the impact from an emotional, cognitive, behavioral, physical, and spiritual context.
Mm-hmm. I call it the palette of grief for children, a blending of emotional, physical, cognitive, behavioral, spirit, like it's just all the different colors of loss. And what happens in a child is they grieve, and they grieve at a developmentally appropriate level. So we as adults need to recognize that a child grieves, and we cannot and we should not lie to them about a suicide. We need to be honest with them at their developmental level, their age level, and share what happened without all the gory details. Let them ask questions. But children do grieve, and they have the same kind of responses as adults. They're angry, they're sad, they're blaming because the death was sudden, unexpected, all the stuff that we talked about. But it's really critical to identify organizations like the Dougy Center, DOUGY. The Dougy Center has so much information for adults to help children. They have valuable resources and books and handouts and tip sheets. So parents and loved ones, adults in a child's life, they are not alone as they talk about this very difficult topic. Let's face it, we as adults don't want to even talk about it. But if you contact Dougy Center, you can have all the information you need on providing support to a child, talking about suicide, explaining it to them, and keeping them a part of the story, because you don't want to traumatize them 20 or 30 years later when they find out.
Yeah. Yeah, like you gave this example in your book, a very dramatic telling that Alex had to face. That's the 11-year-old boy in the story whose father commits suicide. And in the book, his uncle picks him up from school, and nobody's told him what's happened. He just gets picked up by his uncle, and his uncle brings him into the vehicle and then pulls over, and the uncle starts sobbing and says, "Oh my goodness, he's dead." And then he punches the steering wheel and he whispers, "Your dad died this morning." And then he takes a deep breath and says, "He killed himself." What an unbelievable telling for this
Yes.
11-year-old Alex to have to contend with.
Yes, yes. And he doesn't have the tools and strategies to deal with it because it's, first of all, it's his first loss. It's a disenfranchised loss. It's an ambiguous loss. As society, when he gets back to school, he will be so disenfranchised because other kids don't know how to help him. His mom didn't know how to help him. Society needs to help him, but it's up to the adults in his life to get him the support he needs.
Yeah. So if you're in a position where you've got some young people in your life and there has been a tragedy like this, please do inform yourself with the resources from the Dougy Center that Barbara just mentioned. Now I'm going to go back to our listeners. George says, "Great show today. Great show topic today. Thank you. Thank you, George, for recognizing the work that Barbara is doing, and just, the fact that we're having this conversation. So it really does make a huge difference when people are listening and being part of the conversation. And I personally find it to be a really wonderful thing to continue to have conversations like this with experts who really understand, the impact of, these kinds of situations. And in this case, this is your work. Now, I do want to mention again, I'm going back to the book because there are a couple of resources in here that are really very interesting. And one of them is what you just mentioned, which is your palette work. And that is very well outlined and illustrated in your book, where you give people the strategy for creating a palette for themselves, and being able to kind of create this exercise. And you give them the step-by-step tools on how to go through it, and to give themselves, 45 to an hour and a half to actually go through it. But then you really give them such a great step-by-step approach. And I want to just, again, really encourage people that if you can take the time to go through an exercise like this, whether you're a clinician or you want to be self-guided. And she's also got this beautiful visualization script that's in the book as well, and tons of resources. So I just want to thank you so much, Barbara. We're going to be closing down in just a few minutes, but what I wanted to do was just ask you, are there any kind of last words of encouragement or suggestions that you want to give to our listeners before we're finished today? And from me, I just want to just say with great gratitude that we had the time to speak.
I think I'd like to move to what George said in his whatever on the, I don't know how you're seeing it, emails or whatever.
Yeah.
But George says, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. I think we all took the time out of our day to listen to you and I share, to listen to the questions that were, or the sharing that was given by Nan and Steve and the others, and that it shows we need to appreciate each other. We need to appreciate each other's beautiful moments in life and appreciate those losses, and give us all like a virtual hug that we're not alone and we're going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so nice to know that there are people like you, Barbara, who have spent time really understanding, the potential impact on a very personal level and the courage that it takes. And I really want to encourage people to just recognize that you can find your own inner courage just by putting one foot forward. It doesn't have to be a big step. It could be something really little, like, as you said before, Barbara, go online and type in, local online grief support or suicide support. And there'll be organizations in your own communities that are offering programming, and a lot of them being online make it a little easier for people to find the support that they need. So I want to thank you again, Barbara, for spending the time with us today. And to everybody who's listening, we're going to sign off. And I just want to thank Gary, our producer, for hosting us again today, and wishing everybody a gentle day, and be kind to yourself.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowsky, right here on Reality Radio 101.